Some of you I noticed completely one color. So what it is these curves in that are showing you the control points of that surface. And when you have a whole lot of them, it becomes very memory intensive. So one of the things you can do is rebuild the surface. So if you select that surface and go to your surface tools, and then click over here where it says rebuild surface. Oh, this is okay. So I had it as a solid, so I exploded it into surfaces. Now I can rebuild it. Okay, so right now my surface is actually pretty clean, 4 to 4, but some of you guys might have surfaces that look something like this. And you can see how my computer is like totally destroyed by it. So if what you can do is, okay, so here you can see it's like almost totally black. So when you do the control point, it's almost like an art. You want to figure out how many control points you need to describe the surface, but not too many that it becomes overbearing like it is right now. So I think in terms of this kind of surface, I think you want to be down in the double-digit range, so anywhere from 20 to like 60, somewhere around in there. But I would start out with going somewhere around, let's say 30 by 30 is a in between range. So now it's a much more manageable size, and if you click OK, then it's going to rebuild that surface. And so now when you select it, it's actually, you know, much more manageable. Now you can also think about the U and V surfaces. So when you have this type of surface, you can see that by putting them even, we start to get this kind of rectangular shape of the isocurves versus square. So depending on the orientation of your surface and that, you might choose to have more. It may not be equal in both the U and the V directions when you rebuild that surface or when you have it built in the first place. So just keep that in mind. So all of you, I would do this, and you could probably even get away with a little bit fewer, say 20 or so, to describe the surface. And I would rebuild that before you start making 2Ds, because then it calculates a little bit faster. It'll make your project a little bit smaller, the file types. It just make your system more responsive. Okay, so that's the first thing. So let's say for purposes of those in John Abel's class, he's going to ask that you guys are creating kind of a bird's eye view, which is kind of a perspective axonometric sort of view of your system, and then he wants you to make 2D out of that and then start to take that into Illustrator. So to do that, you want to look at creating your perspective view, get the view that you want it to be, and then select the objects that you want. And then make sure that this perspective, that's the active view before you make 2D. And then you want to make sure you click Current View, Hidden Lines, I think he wants you to use maintain source layers too. But it's going to make this 2D drawing, and then so we'll use this as the process to show, kind of how you've done. How many people have been able to successfully go from this, make 2D, and take it into Illustrator? Okay, so most of you have. All right. So the next thing is you can see that it's here, but if we go into the top view, that's where it's going to show up. So it's already selected, so let's just do, without messing with it at all, make sure that you have the top view. Oops, I screwed that up. Okay, so I accidentally messed up. So if you go over to layer, you can go to select sub-object layers, and so you can select just the layers on particular layers, or objects on particular layers. So we'll do this export selected. So make sure that that you export it as an AI file. So here you have a couple of different options. I think you want to preserve the model scale, and you should think about what kind of what size will fit on your page. So you start at a pretty decent direction. So I'm going to use 1/8 inch. Okay, so now let's open up Illustrator and import that file. Okay, so we want to make sure you guys are going to have a particular artboard size. So I think you guys are putting together a PowerPoint presentation, so you want to think about what that size is. I'm just going to use letter for now. Okay, and then once you've got that done, you can hit escape. And then use Control A or Command A to select everything, and you can drag and move this to where you want it. Now let's say that also that you might need to scale it. So if you are, and there's one thing, you can see some white. I am going to double click on this layer. I'm going to change that color. And then I want to make sure that everything comes out as black, so I'm going to control everything, Control A, select everything. You can also select everything by going up here to the top and select all, or you can select by appearance or fill and stroke. So those are also some nice things. But I'm going to go over here to my outline, my stroke, and I want to make sure that that's black. So I'll choose that and then come over here and make that black. So all the lines I now know are black. So now we can see it. So let's say that I want this a little bit bigger. We can, there's a couple of things. You could go over here and use this scale tool, or you can just grab these handles, and if you hold down the shift key while you're doing this, you can scale it to whatever size you want, and it stays in the correct aspect ratio. Okay, so then the next thing we want to do is, I find it easiest to organize the layers like they are now, where they're making hidden the hidden layers and then also this visible. So I would turn off the hidden layers for the moment, and then I would focus on this Make 2D on the visible layers. So, and I'm going to create a new layer down here by going down to the bottom of the swatch, creating a new layer, and I'm going to call this one Silhouette. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move some of these lines that I want that are the silhouette of this object. I'm going to move these. So the way you do that, select what you have. I didn't select them all, but you can come over here to the layer palette, and you see this little square over here. Well, let me move this over so you can see it better. So you see this little square? You can drag that, so that can move these objects from one layer to another layer. And if you hold down the Alt key, you can also, the Alt or the Option key, you can also copy things from one layer to the other just by moving this little green dot, because this represents the way it, the selection on that layer. Okay. So the next thing, so we've got these on their different layer, but we want to start to modify their appearance. So if we select that box right here, this little circle, then that also selects all of that, all of those objects on that layer, and we can go to the stroke palette, and let's say we want to increase the stroke of those by 2. Okay. And then I want to select these, and I want to switch these down to, let's say, 1 point. So now we're starting to get some depth. So let's go through and we can start to select these other pieces and start to move these over. And then we're going to drag them over to our silhouette. and make sure that they're all on that same 2 points. So now we start to see that we have a couple of issues here. So we have this line here that's actually not in that silhouette, so we want to split that line. Using the scissors tool. And we're just going to cut it off there. And then I'm going to use this direct selection tool, which is this one here, A. And I want to go in and I just want to select this line. And I want to put on smart tracking. Hold on. So go up to View, Smart Guides. And sometimes if you have some thick stuff like this, if you go up to View and Outline, it will take away all of the line work, so you can just see the options. So I'm going to select those points, and then I just want to move them over to here. Now I'll go back to my preview mode. Now I can select this line here and move it back down to this Make 2D and put that back at 1 point. So I'm going to look at making these things just actually a little bit less, so like 0.75. So one of the things to make these exploded drawings and these diagrams really pop is this silhouette line. So now that we've got those set up, now we can look at, we can lock those down in the layers palette, and then we can come over here and see what we have in terms of the Make 2D lines. So what are basically all of our hidden lines. So we can select all of those, and then I would say let's go down and push those back to 0.5, and then let's make those dashed. So we, in our stroke palette here, we're just going to open those up and click on dashed lines. Right now it's at 6, so sometimes what you can do, like this gets in the way of kind of seeing your line work, these handles. You can go up to View, and where is it? Hide edges, right there. So we can see what we have. And that looks pretty good. You might edit some of these things and start to take out some and add some others. Like there's some of like this one here, that one doesn't look like it needs to be there. Overall, it starts to look pretty good. But what I might do here is select all of those and actually change this to these backgrounds to maybe a gray color. So I'm going to go over to this palette here, click on this top button, and then I'm going to select grayscale, and so I can turn this thing down to, let's say, like 86. Okay. Okay, so once we have that all done, let's lock up that layer, and now we can create some new layers for annotation. So when you think about annotation, you want to think about how to keep it nice and organized. When you're doing a set of wall sections, you want to think about the text in the annotation as part of the composition of the page, so that it doesn't just seem to be willy-nilly. You want to think about it as being composed, aligned, and clear. So you might start to do something like this, where you take this type tool and then I'm going to hold the Alt key and the Shift key down. Alt key, start dragging, and then hold the Shift key down, and start to create a series of these boxes of text tags. I should have an idea of how many I need. Move them into a position where I feel like it's starting to balance. And then I can come over here to the Align tools, and if they don't show up in your palette, you can't see over there. There you go. So this Align tool here, if that's not there, you can go up to Window and click on Align, and it'll bring up this Align palette. So what we can do, I just dragged it, and some of these are different size. I can distribute the objects vertically, and so it evens them out nice and clean, and I can make sure that they're aligned to the left, which they are, or I could have them aligned to the center, but we're going to align to the left. And so I'm going to create a sub-layer now, which I'm going to call Leaders. And then I'm going to click back up here and click another sub-layer. I'm going to call those Text. I'm going to take all of those, so I just selected all my text, and I'm going to come up here to the selected artwork, and I'm just going to drag it to text. So now everything is in that text is there. And now I'm going to start working on the leaders. So I'm going to lock those text down so they're not moving around. And then I'm going to select the leaders palette so I can start to put together the leaders to point out different things. So one of the things with the smart guides is that it aligns to different things, and that's going to be fine, but I find that they can be annoying, so I have them off most of the time, especially when you're wanting to create a leader. We can go back and use the Align tools to clean up some things. Okay, so what we're going to do now I want to make sure I'm going to change this color to something I can actually see. Alright, so just using the pen tool now, I'm going to start to create some lines. So this is showing it as filled. I'll just swap between those two. And so here, now I want to start to evaluate how this leader looks. And so right now the leader, because of the size of the line weight, is actually starting to compete with the drawing, and we don't want that. So I'm going to come over here and choose the stroke palette. You can also do it up here at the top. You can always do it there, but just old habits. So I switched it down to 0.5. And then in the stroke palettes, we can also start to develop the endpoints. So if we go down to the arrowheads down here, we have a selection of different arrowheads that you can choose. And so this is at the start and the other is at the end. So we ended here, so I want to look at the end point. You can always swap it using this little swap piece. But let's say you have a couple of different arrows. I would, for your purposes, for architectural purposes, I would only use a couple of different arrows. So the ones that I would see as acceptable are something like arrow number 5. Arrow number 9 is more typical. And arrow 11 also works as a pretty typical. I would never use any of these things that are funky, like the end points. I would never do those. But you can also, for these kind of diagrams, I think arrow 24 and 21, 22, all of those are actually pretty good ones to use. So that's nice because now we can see here that it's just a nice little pointer to point to what we're going to do. And then once you have that, I would just copy this using the Alt key. So then the next thing you have to do is you have to think about how you never want these things to cross one another. So if you're going to adjust this thing, use the direct selection tool, and you might start hierarchical from this point. Then you might do something like so once you have that as your kind of basic piece, now you can go a couple of different ways with it. You can add more information, so lock that down, and then you can start to create another layer. And from that layer, then you can start to fill in different things. So if you wanted to start to add color, I would do it over the top of it rather than in and of itself. But for there, that's the basic kind of piece of how to create this diagram. Questions about that? Is that pretty straightforward? Okay. All right, so basically what we just did also works for elevations and plans and sections. Okay, the difference being for most of these for your plans, you don't have to put dimensions and things on it. And in fact, it gets a little messy if you do. So I wouldn't worry about putting dimensions on. If you do, you can create those dimensions within Rhino and import them over, but there's some adjustments that you have to do with like text size and stuff like that you would have to edit. So it's not quite as clean. Some other things that you can do is you could take a little rendering of this same shot at this same perspective, and you can save that as a JPEG with maybe some shadows or tones and import that as a background image onto this. And then there's a little skewing and things in scaling to get it to fit right, but that could also look pretty nice. Isn't a bad way of going about things. And you could also add some drop shadows and things like that, but I'm of the mind the simpler the better. The better looking it is, the clearer it is. But the most important piece, I think, is making sure that you keep all of your stuff organized. So questions about this in this step? Does everyone feel comfortable being able to create line weights and understanding how to apply them and how you should apply them in Illustrator? Okay. All right, so once you have this, you want to save it. Now to put this in your PowerPoint presentation, he's asking you to use PowerPoint. I ask my students to use PDFs all the time instead of PowerPoint because you can keep the vector line work and you can zoom in and it will keep it nice and crisp if you're in the middle of a presentation. But for PowerPoint, you want to export this as a PNG or a JPEG, one of the two. So you want to do this by, well, there's a couple of different ways you can do this, but just do file export, and let's say PNG. The critical thing to do is to use artboards. I think that helps getting the alignment. If you created the artboard, the size that where it's going to go, that becomes helpful. Otherwise, if you don't use it, it's going to be very strict about the edges. So it's not going to give you any kind of play room or wiggle room. So I usually generally make sure that they use artboards because then you can take it and use it for other pieces and you can crop it down later if you need to. But it always gives you that option. And so here's the other thing I would do is, even though you are looking at using it on screen in a PowerPoint presentation, the fact is that screens now are going up to a higher DPI. We have Retina screens. I mean, you have 300 DPI on your phone. Anybody has a MacBook Retina, that's where that's going. So at a minimum would be 150, but I would generally export it at 300 DPI. Because you also want to think that how are you going to use this later? So in your portfolios and things like that, you want to be able to have that as available to you without having to go back in and save another option. So here's a couple of options too that you can think of. One is with the PNG. One of the reasons I like the PNG because it gives you an alpha channel, so you can make something transparent in the background. That becomes handy when you're exporting entourage and things like that. You know, outlines of people that you might use. So you can choose it as transparent, and so it will read that as an alpha channel in most programs. But putting it as white is never a problem either. So that's up to you guys. Just think about what those options would be. Okay, so that is the main gist of this part. Let's see. Okay, what kind of questions? So I think that will help everybody in Abel's class do what they need to do. What about some? Let's spend the rest of the day answering questions.
So when you do inspect hidden lines, you're exporting it. That makes two layers in Illustrator. Is that correct?
It makes, well, you have two layers. The two layers that you have are this visible lines and the hidden lines. And then underneath there, each path, each is a separate object. So, but really only makes two different layers.
Yeah, okay. So if you were like uncheck that thing and show it in lines, it would just show the visible line.
Yep. So when I undo that, so now we have a different view. And this is a good view to use for instance, to make live paint. Did I show you guys live paint before?
Yeah, but I forgot.
Okay. All right. So what I would do, so we want to keep, when you use live paint, it's going to kind of group the live paint with the line work that you've created. So what we want to do is we want to keep those things separate so you can control the outside of the lines and just the line work itself. So what I would do is select and holding down the Shift key, so I have all of that, and I would copy holding down the Alt key, copy this to group 7, to this new layer. Okay, so we want to select all of that. Copy that to layer 7 too. And we're going to call that live paint. So now we have both of those. Now we have all the artwork that we want here. Now when we do live paint, let's drag this down to the bottom because we want the line work over the top of it. Now when we select all of it and we use the live paint tool, which is K, now we have it separate. We can select the line work, turn off the stroke, but we still have the strokes over here. And now when we select this information here, we can now start to adjust the transparency without all of the line work being transparent as well. And so now when we turn on like the hidden lines, we can start to get a much more kind of nuanced drawing out of that. That make sense? Okay. As PDFs. You also, to turn it in, just combine all of those in a binder. So you can, in Acrobat, here, let's just do that right now. So here you can just combine files into a PDF, just right there as a task, and then you just click and add the files right there. So it's simple, then you rename it, and that's what you turn in. Okay? And then for here, let's show some ways that we can do this here. So the interesting thing, and I think I've told this to you guys before, but the Illustrator format is basically the same as the PDF format. They share almost everything. So a lot of times if you have a PDF file, you can change the file extension to .ai instead of .pdf, and it will open natively right into Illustrator. So that's sometimes really cool when you have multiple, when you find like master plans, or you're doing research and you see plans that are made as PDFs that are line work or maps or diagrams. A lot of times you can take those and just import them and open them up right in there. So all we have to do is do a save a copy as an Adobe PDF down below, and that's all you have to do. And let's see here, let me just make a couple of artboards. So let's see. So here you can do it if you put them on multiple artboards. It's going to put all of them there, but you can also select as a range, and you can select an individual. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's just select all. Which artboard you want to save, right? So here's some Illustrator defaults. So some of these things, this works in both InDesign and Illustrator, and we'll get into this a little bit more. But the PDF export, this is something that you can modify how you save out the PDFs for the different sizes. So I've made a couple of special templates that reduce the file size but still try to keep the quality. But if you just stick with Illustrator default, that's fine. And I'm going to go over some things that Tony in the printing and those guys have some specific requirements to how to create your files to print. So things like flattening and some things like that. They have a template, a guide for you guys to look at. So if you guys go down and ask them for their sheet, in fact I have one in my back pocket. It has several different basically configurations of dialog boxes, and what I've asked them to do is send a hard copy of this that I'll put up on Angel for all of you guys. But if you guys are going in to print, then just ask them for this before you go down there to print, so that you can save some headaches. But mainly it has to do with layers and flattening. You know, getting artwork that's way too complicated for the printer to spool. Yeah.
When I put in my poster for our last project, the color didn't turn out the way I wanted. Is there a way to adjust that in the printer?
Well, so there's a couple of different ways. One is the problem is that the screen is not calibrated to the printer, and we do have some tools to do that, but we haven't calibrated it. So I've been talking to Tony about getting at least one computer downstairs in the print lab that's calibrated so that you can preview the colors. So the first thing I would do is I would print out a selection of colors. I'd take a color swatch, the ones that are critical for you, and also some tonal values, and print that out as just a little strip, you know, a little tiny thing, so you can see how things are going to be shifted. Then you can go into Photoshop or Illustrator and start to adjust the images and the colors to be printed out better. But you have to think about that for each color, for each type of paper too, because the bond paper, the cheap stuff, prints out in a totally different way, in a totally different color than the glossy paper. So a lot of it's just trial and error. But just realize that a lot of times it prints out darker than you think it's going to print out. So you should keep that in mind and thinking about that right off the bat, that everything that looks good on the screen is probably too dark. And you probably want it a little bit less contrasty, right? So we're working on that. Yeah, that's part of it. Part of it is the type of paper. So like the bond paper bleeds, so it bleeds. So I would almost never recommend printing as a black background with white lines over the top. Just don't ever print a dark background. That's just waiting, that's trouble. So, and then on the glossy paper, it does put down a serious amount of ink, and there is some of that bleed. But it's also just comes down to how it interprets the colors from your screen, and what you see looks right because your screen can project way more colors than it can print, and it prints it, and it also does it differently. So the screen is showing us light, so it's actually projecting colored light, whereas in a print it's reflecting light. So that's how you get the color. So those two different processes also make a big difference in how we perceive it. So it just takes some experience, you know, of printing and messing up to kind of find out what it's going to look like. And so what I've done in the past is I've created a set of actions, so a filter in Photoshop if I'm going to print out a rendering that automatically kind of, so I do it until it looks good on my screen, and then I apply this filter that goes over the top of it that adjusts things to make it so that when I print it out, it's closer to what I'm expecting, even though it looks like crap on my screen. It'll look good when it's printed out. And it's also a good kind of idea to think about creating a set of colors or a palette of colors that you work with a lot, that you know, okay, this orange is going to look like this, and this is the orange that I'm going to use, or this is my red, and you know, this is my black. When I want black, this is actually like a gray. When I'm saying, you know what I'm getting at. So,
you make that filter yourself?
Yeah, I did.
You just printed it out and then tweaked it.
Yeah, so yeah, it took me kind of a couple of iterations, and when you're printing on the big printer, what you can do is lay out like several different options, and so you just lay out with different effects on each one, and then you can go, okay, this is closer, so I'll start to take that one and print out another set of variations, so you can test out, you know, 5 or 6 variations at a time and then you can get it done usually with like three 1-foot prints, which isn't too bad as far as cost-wise. Just takes a little bit of, you have to do that before you're in crunch time, you know? Just be a little bit smarter about that.